It was a typical late-night shift for Ethan, a college student working at a morgue to save up for his tuition in the late 1960s. Uh, the job was monotonous but paid well enough, even if it had the eerie coldness that came being surrounded by the dead. Ethan had grown numb to the environment, handling bodies, working in silence, all routine at this point. Tonight, however, something felt off. Ethan was tasked with showing the ropes to a new hire, Daniel, a kid fresh out of high school, who seemed way too jittery for the job. Daniel's eyes flicked around the sterile room, landing on each body with nervous twitches, his breath shallow. Ethan couldn't blame him. It was hard getting used to the morgue's unsettling stillness. After all, there was something about the dead that no amount of training could prepare you for. Ethan gave Daniel a quick rundown, explaining how to move a body from storage to the examination room. Tonight's task involved an old man, Mr. Harris, who had died of a heart attack a few days ago. His body had stiffened with rigor mortis, making it heavy and difficult to move. As they rolled the gurney down the dimly lit hallway, Daniel kept trying to break the silence with awkward, nervous chatter, glancing repeatedly at the corpse under the white sheet. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting jittery shadows along the walls. Something about the way the light bounced off the corners sent a chill down Ethan's spine. He shook it off, convincing himself it was just his mind playing tricks in the stale quiet. Suddenly, as they approached the examination room, the sheet over Mr. Harris shifted. At first, Ethan thought it was just the movement of the gurney, but then, to his horror, the body began to sit up, slowly, deliberately. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The pale face of the dead man emerged from the sheet, eyes wide open, staring straight ahead with an empty gaze. His body kept rising, as if being pulled by an invisible force. Daniel screamed, a sharp, high-pitched sound that echoed down the hallway. He stumbled back, nearly tripping over his own feet as the corpse sat fully upright, its head slowly turning toward them. Ethan felt a paralyzing fear grip him, his heart pounding in his chest so hard he thought it might explode. Then, just as suddenly as it had risen, the corpse slumped back onto the gurney, lifeless once more. Daniel was gone before Ethan could say anything, his footsteps echoing down the corridor as he ran for the exit. Ethan stood frozen, staring at the body. He had heard of postmortem spasms, scientific explanations for bodies moving after death, but this was different. The way Mr. Harris had sat up, the unnatural slowness of it, felt wrong. Ethan finally broke from his trance and ran after Daniel. They both collapsed outside the morgue, pale and gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Daniel stammered, his voice shaking. Did he really sit up? Ethan tried to answer but found himself speechless. His mind raced with the scientific explanations he'd been taught, but no amount of logic could explain the unsettling way the dead man had moved. He muttered something about muscle spasms, but even he didn't believe it. The next night, the morgue felt different. Every flicker of the lights, every creak in the building, seemed loaded with sinister intent. Ethan found himself glancing over his shoulder constantly, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. Daniel quit the next day, but Ethan continued working, though the memory of that night haunted him. Mr. Harris was just a body, he told himself over and over, but the truth gnawed at him. There was something wrong about the way he had moved, something unnatural. Weeks later, Ethan was working alone again, late at night. The morgue was silent, save for the low hum of the equipment. But then, just as he was finishing his shift, he heard it, a faint whisper. It was so soft he thought it might be the wind, but there were no windows open. The whisper grew louder, clearer, like someone was speaking just behind him. His heart raced as he slowly turned, scanning the room. There was no one there. Then the lights flickered, and the whispering stopped. Silence. Ethan stood frozen, his breath shaky, when suddenly the lights cut out completely, plunging the room into darkness. His flashlight flickered to life, the beam cutting through the heavy blackness. He turned it toward the examination table. Mr. Harris's body was gone. Cold terror gripped Ethan as he frantically swept the flashlight around the room. The door to the cold storage unit was open, and there, standing in the doorway, was Mr. Harris. The corpse stood unnaturally still, eyes wide open, staring blankly into the darkness. Ethan's mouth went dry. He couldn't move. The body took a slow, shuffling step forward, the sound of its bare feet on the cold floor echoing in the silence. With a guttural moan, the corpse lunged. Ethan bolted down the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him, he could hear the dragging footsteps of the dead man, following him through the darkness. He threw open the door to the main hall and sprinted outside, slamming the door behind him. For the rest of the night, Ethan sat in his car, shaking. No amount of science could explain what had just happened. He knew what he had seen, and the cold, dead eyes of Mr. Harris would haunt him forever. Ending scene. Years later, Ethan would recount the story to friends, passing it off as a creepy tale from his days at the morgue. But in the quiet of night, when the world was still, he would wake up sweating, heart racing, with the image of Mr. Harris standing in the cold, dark hallway burned into his mind. Some things, Ethan had learned, defy explanation. In a small town nestled among rolling hills, a legend has lingered in the shadows of the old high school for years. They say it's just a story, a tale passed around among students like a rite of passage. But those who've braved the haunted halls know there's something more to it. It all revolves around Mrs. Margaret Calloway, an old science teacher whose presence was as formidable as her knowledge. She was known for her strict demeanor and no-nonsense attitude, her steel gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, eyes that seemed to pierce through any pretense. Students respected her, and yet there was an unspoken fear of disappointing her. But life, as it often does, took a sudden turn one fateful afternoon. During a particularly intense biology lesson, Mrs. Calloway clutched her chest, her breath escaping her as she collapsed onto the floor, her lifeless body falling in front of her shocked students. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with gasps of disbelief and panic, a moment frozen in time that would haunt the school forever. In the weeks that followed, the school was a changed place. Her classroom, once filled with the sounds of learning and laughter, was sealed off, the door marked with a "Do Not Enter" sign that seemed to loom larger than life. Rumors spread like wildfire among the students, whispers of ghostly figures and chalkboards mysteriously filled with writings, and everyone knew they were meant to be avoided. But there was a dare that loomed large, an unspoken challenge among the bravest of the brave to spend a night in Mrs. Calloway's classroom. One crisp autumn evening, after a particularly exhilarating football game, a group of friends, Jake, Alia, Marcus, and Lila, decided to accept that challenge. The air was thick with a mix of excitement and trepidation as they approached the old science wing, the dim lights flickering like dying stars overhead. Each creak of the floorboards underfoot echoed through the silence, amplifying their fears. They reached the locked door of Mrs. Calloway's classroom, their hearts pounding in unison. In a moment of recklessness, Marcus managed to pry open a cracked window, and with one last look at each other, they climbed inside. As they stepped into the classroom, an overwhelming sense of unease washed over them, a feeling that they were intruding upon something sacred. The room remained unchanged since that fateful day, the desks lined up as if waiting for students who would never return. Alia, trying to lighten the mood, cracked a joke, but her voice wavered. They wandered around the room, the oppressive atmosphere heavy like a wet blanket, when suddenly Lila, with her uncanny sixth sense for the eerie, stopped dead in her tracks. "Do you smell that?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. At first, Jake didn't notice anything, but then it hit him. A faint, nostalgic scent of chalk dust mingled with a floral perfume that tugged at his memories. It was unmistakably Mrs. Calloway's perfume, sweet, yet suffocating. Just then, a chilling creak interrupted their reverie, drawing their attention to the chalkboard. Before their eyes, a piece of chalk rolled off the ledge, crashing onto the floor, the sound echoing ominously in the quiet room. Fear gripped them, but none dared to move. And then, as if an invisible hand were at work, words began to form on the board. "Sit down." Panic surged through them, adrenaline igniting their fight-or-flight instincts. They didn't need a second invitation. They bolted for the door, hearts racing, the sound of chalk scraping across the board following them like a ghostly whisper. Outside, they gasped for breath, the cool night air feeling electric against their flushed skin. They had to convince themselves it was just their imaginations running wild, but the stories had already spread through the school like wildfire, and none of them dared to return to that room. The next day, Jake tried to brush off the events as mere youthful imagination, a blend of nerves and excitement, but the others couldn't shake the chilling dread. Lila, her face pale, recounted how the janitor had found new writings on the board every morning, messages like, "Stay quiet," and "Pay attention," scrawled as if a lesson were still being taught. "I think she's still there, still teaching," Leela murmured, her voice trembling as the words hung heavy in the air. The group exchanged nervous glances, the gravity of their experience settling like a stone in their stomachs. As the weeks passed, the legend of Mrs. Calloway only grew, fueled by the whispers of students too frightened to even glance at the old science wing. Jake found himself drawn back to that night, replaying every moment in his mind, grappling with the reality of what they had witnessed. The fear had changed him, each passing day weighing heavier on his shoulders, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the lesson was far from over. One afternoon, with curiosity mingling with dread, Jake returned to the school, drawn by an inexplicable urge to confront the fear that had haunted him. The building was empty, the silence thick and oppressive. He stood before the old classroom door, his heart pounding in his chest as he recalled Lila's words. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open, stepping into the darkness of the room. The faint scent of perfume lingered in the air, sending chills down his spine. The classroom appeared unchanged, and as he glanced at the chalkboard, he felt a sudden chill race down his spine. The board was filled with fresh messages, words swirling like smoke, the latest saying, "You've returned." With that, he bolted, running through the halls, the echo of his footsteps following him. He stumbled out into the light, panting and shaken, but he knew that whatever was haunting that room was still waiting. From that day on, the fear of Mrs. Calloway's classroom remained a part of him, an indelible mark on his soul. As the years passed and high school turned into a distant memory, the tales continued, whispered among students, a chilling reminder that some lessons never end. In 1979, in the quieter parts of Jackson, Mississippi, a young woman named Dana and her roommate were adjusting to life on a rundown street in a slightly sketchy part of town. The building they lived in had a certain air of history, but it was far from charming. Cracks in the walls whispered stories of neglect, and the creaks in the floorboards hinted at an unseen presence, one Dana hadn't yet noticed. It was a warm Sunday night, and Dana's roommate, a talented but frequently absent musician, had left for a weekend tour. She had told Dana she'd be back on Monday, leaving her friend with the apartment to herself. Dana didn't mind. The idea of having the apartment to herself wasn't daunting, but something about that night felt off. As the evening drifted into night, the loneliness of the empty apartment began to sink into Dana's skin. The faint sounds of the outside world were muffled by the thick, humid air that seemed to cling to everything. She was alone, surrounded by the peeling wallpaper and shadows that seemed to deepen as the night wore on. The apartment had always had a strange vibe, too quiet, too still, but tonight it felt more suffocating than usual. At around midnight, Dana found herself in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake off a growing unease. She was just beginning to drift into an uneasy sleep when she heard a sound, a rattling. She sat up slowly, trying to listen more closely. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct, coming from the front of the apartment. The rattling was followed by a low creak. Her heart quickened. Was it the door? It was late, and no one was supposed to be there. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, that her roommate had likely returned early without letting her know. But as the seconds ticked by, something felt wrong. The lights hadn't come on, and the footsteps that followed were far too quiet to belong to her friend. Dana's breath hitched. The realization hit her. Someone else was in the apartment, someone who wasn't supposed to be. She listened, frozen in place. The shuffling sound grew closer, slow and deliberate. The intruder wasn't in any rush, methodically moving through the apartment, as if they were taking inventory of their surroundings. Dana's pulse raced. The only thing between her and the intruder was a single door, a flimsy wooden one that suddenly felt too thin. Panic began to set in, and she instinctively glanced toward the back door, but that was no escape. It was always locked from the outside, and without a key, she was trapped. trapped in a small apartment with a stranger creeping closer and closer. Dana was religious, though not in a way that dictated her every move. But in that moment, she prayed, not just for protection, but for clarity, for a way to get through this. As she prayed, a strange sense of calm washed over her. It wasn't rational, but something about the stillness that followed seemed to give her strength. If she moved or made a sound, she knew it would be over. Her only option was to remain perfectly still, to hide in plain sight, hoping he wouldn't notice her in the darkness. Then came the sound she dreaded, a soft creak as the door to her bedroom opened. She squeezed her eyes shut, her breath shallow and quiet, as though even breathing too loudly might betray her. The room was so quiet she could hear her heartbeat in her ears. The intruder moved closer, his shadow spilling across the floor. In the dim light, she saw a tall, looming figure standing just inside the doorway. Dana could feel his presence even before he moved. He wasn't just tall, he was massive, easily towering over her 6'4" fiancé. He paused at the doorway as though he was studying her, trying to decide what to do next. The silence stretched on unbearably thick, as if time itself had stopped. The man stepped closer. Dana kept her eyes closed, every muscle in her body tensed with fear, waiting for the inevitable moment when he would reach out to her. She could feel his eyes on her, inspecting her as if he could sense she was awake. Then, he did something that sent chills down her spine. He tilted his head slowly, as if he was trying to get a better look at her, a better understanding of who he was sharing this dark space with. Dana couldn't help it. Her breath caught and her body trembled. She knew she was running out of time. This was it. Gathering what little courage she had left, Dana let out a blood-curdling scream, one so loud it seemed to shake the walls of the apartment. Her voice echoed in the small room, piercing through the silence. For a moment, she thought he might retaliate, but then, almost as if the scream had broken some spell, she heard the sound of retreating footsteps. The man backed away, disappearing through the door. The front door creaked once again as he left, leaving Dana in the cold, oppressive quiet that followed. She didn't move for what felt like hours, too afraid to even check if he was truly gone. But when she finally worked up the courage, she bolted for the front door, locking it as quickly as she could before collapsing onto the floor. Tears of relief streamed down her face as she flipped on every light in the apartment, shaking as the reality of the situation sunk in. This wasn't a nightmare. It wasn't a figment of her imagination. A man had been in her apartment, standing over her while she pretended to sleep. The police arrived within the hour after she called, but there was little they could do. The man had taken only a few dollars from her purse, and Dana hadn't gotten a clear look at his face. When the police showed her a lineup of small photographs, they all seemed to blend together, but eventually, she chose one. The detective assisting her sighed when she made her choice. "I wish you'd chosen this one," he said, pointing to another photo. "He's 6'6", just got out of prison last week, and lives 2 streets away." The unsettling coincidence stuck with Dana for weeks. Whoever that man was, he had been close by. The police report didn't go anywhere, but a week later, she read about a similar break-in nearby. The news left her even more rattled. Dana couldn't shake the fear, couldn't escape the feeling of vulnerability. Even after her roommate returned, she decided to leave the apartment for a while, staying with a friend across town. Every night, the shadows in the corner of her vision seemed darker, more oppressive. She knew she was safe, logically, but she couldn't convince her body to believe it. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the figure standing at the foot of her bed, his head tilted, his shadow stretching across the room. It would take months before she could sleep peacefully again, and even longer before she felt at home in her own skin. But the memory of that night never left her. The moment she realized how close she'd come to danger, how fragile the illusion of safety could be. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more spine-tingling tales, make sure to support the channel by subscribing. Don't forget to check out all our other videos for more thrilling and haunting stories.